I'm Amanda, 32 years old, and my entire life took a sharp, irreversible turn during my father's retirement dinner last spring. The grand banquet hall shimmered under the glow of chandeliers, echoing the weight of decades of his so called success. Laughter floated through the air, and glasses clinked in celebration. My father, Richard Harrington, stood tall, holding a crystal glass in one hand, a picture of triumph in his designer suit. My real children are the ones who have made me proud, he declared, his voice cutting through the applause. Then he turned, his piercing gaze locked onto mine from across the room. His next words hit like a slap. "You can leave," he said, loudly and clearly, so that everyone turned to look. My face flushed hot with shame, my knees trembled beneath me, but I stood up, my breath catching in my throat. That alone would have been humiliating enough. But then, in that moment of despair, my husband Scott rose to his feet as well. That simple act, his quiet solidarity, was the start of something that would redefine the very concept of family for me. I grew up in Brookline, one of Boston's wealthiest suburbs, where manicured lawns and pristine colonial homes lined the streets. From the outside, our family looked like the American dream. Inside, it was something else entirely. My father wasn't just a senior banking executive. He was a man who measured love in achievements and withheld approval like a reward to be earned. My mother, Elaine, was graceful and elegant, a quiet presence who faded more with each passing year under the weight of my father's dominance. She offered hushed comforts when he raged, but never openly challenged him. When I was 20, I lost her to breast cancer. Along with her passing went the last buffer between me and the full force of my father's expectations. From that moment on, there was nothing to shield me from his unrelenting judgment. My older siblings were everything I was not. Jason, 4 years my senior, followed in our father's footsteps into the world of finance. He graduated from Wharton and landed a prestigious job at a top investment firm. Kimberly, 2 years older than me, became a cardiothoracic surgeon, stacking degrees and accolades with mechanical precision. My father called them the golden children, the ones who upheld the Harrington name, the ones who counted. And then there was me. Since childhood, I had always been drawn to the arts. Books became my refuge, my sanctuary when real life grew too sharp, too loud, too painful. I still remember my 12th birthday when I played Debussy's Clair de Lune during a recital in our living room. The space was packed with family friends, all seated politely as I approached the black grand piano, hands trembling with anticipation. Halfway through the piece, I struck one wrong note, just one. My father's reaction was immediate and devastating. He stood abruptly, adjusted his tie, and walked out without a word. The room fell deathly silent, the only sound the echo of the front door shutting behind him. I finished the piece, though tears blurred the keys. That moment was seared into me. One mistake. That's all it took to be dismissed. College was my first taste of independence. I chose to study literature at Amherst, even though my father insisted I apply to business school. "You're throwing your life away on fairy tales," he barked when I showed him my acceptance letter. True to form, he refused to support my education, calling it a waste. So I cobbled together scholarships, took part-time jobs, and fought for every credit. I was proud of what I achieved. Still, even in moments of triumph, his voice haunted me, asking why it wasn't more. Romantic relationships were difficult. I gravitated toward men who mirrored my father's coldness, or else I pushed away anyone who showed real affection, afraid they'd see what I feared, that I wasn't enough. Then came Scott. 3 years ago, I was in a small Cambridge bookstore browsing the classics. I reached for a rare edition of Jane Eyre, the last copy. At the exact moment, someone else did, too. Our hands touched. I looked up and met the gentle gaze of Scott Taylor. His smile was warm, his demeanor kind. "You take it," he said. "Anyone hunting for Bronte deserves it more than me." We ended up at the coffee shop next door, talking for hours. Scott was a software engineer, but he loved books with the same intensity I did. More than that, he listened, truly listened, without checking his watch or waiting to speak. When I confessed my dream of starting a small publishing house for underrepresented authors, he didn't laugh. He didn't brush it aside. Instead, he leaned in, asked detailed questions, and helped me begin shaping a plan. 6 months later, with Scott's unwavering support and his help running financial projections, I launched Lighthouse Press. We began with just two literary fiction titles from diverse voices. By our second year, one book had won a regional award, and our catalog grew to 6 titles annually. No, I wasn't making a fortune, but for the first time in my life, I was proud of what I'd built. Scott and I were married in a small, intimate ceremony at the Boston Public Library. My father didn't attend. He cited a business meeting in Chicago. Jason sent an elaborate but impersonal gift. Only Kimberly showed up. She slipped out right after the vows to catch a flight to a medical conference. As Scott and I danced that evening, surrounded not by blood relatives, but by friends and his warm, welcoming family, he whispered into my ear, "They don't deserve you." Nearly 2 years passed. Then, out of nowhere, I received an invitation to my father's retirement gala. After 4 decades at First Atlantic Bank, Richard Harrington was stepping down as executive vice president. The event would be held at the Hawthorne, the most exclusive restaurant in Boston. "You don't have to go," Scott said gently, watching my hands tremble as I held the thick, cream-colored invitation. "Maybe this is him trying to reach out," I replied, though my voice betrayed doubt. "Maybe things will be different now that he's leaving work behind." On the night of the gala, I stood in front of the mirror in our bedroom, wearing a deep navy blue dress, more expensive than anything I usually allowed myself. My hair was professionally styled, my makeup meticulous, carefully concealing the exhaustion etched into my features after a week of anxiety-fueled insomnia. "You look beautiful," Scott said as he adjusted his tie beside me. "I feel like I'm going to be sick," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Just as we were about to leave, a panic attack hit. Scott sat beside me on the edge of the bed, holding my hand, guiding me through slow, measured breaths. My therapist had taught me the techniques to manage moments like this, and now Scott gently rubbed slow, soothing circles on my back, helping me through the spiraling panic. My breaths were shallow at first, rapid and uneven, but gradually they began to slow as I clung to his presence. "We can still cancel," he reminded me, his voice calm and steady, a quiet shelter amid my inner storm. "No," I said finally, my voice shaky but firm as I reached into my purse to reapply my lipstick, the tube trembling in my fingers. "I need to do this. I have to try one last time." As we drove into the heart of downtown Boston, the city lights shimmered on the windshield like scattered stars. Scott reached over and clasped my hand, grounding me. "No matter what happens tonight," he said softly, "you have people who love you just for being you." I nodded, appreciating the sentiment, but unable to truly believe it. A lifetime of being taught that love had to be earned through perfection had rooted itself so deeply that part of me still believed I had to win my father's approval to be worthy of love at all. Tonight felt like my final opportunity to do just that. The Hawthorne loomed ahead of us, a stately beacon rising against the twilight sky. Its elegant, historic facade was lit up against the spring evening, glowing like something out of a grand novel. As we pulled up, a young valet in a sharply pressed red jacket stepped forward with precision, opening my door like a practiced gesture in a long tradition of polished service. The click of my heels against the cobblestone path echoed in my ears, each step marking a countdown I couldn't stop. "Breathe," Scott whispered, his hand resting lightly at the small of my back, grounding me. Inside, the maitre d' guided us to the private banquet room where the celebration had already begun. The room sparkled, Chandeliers cast a warm golden light across the crowd, where about 70 guests mingled in elegant evening wear, champagne flutes in hand. A string quartet played quietly in a far corner, their melodies nearly lost beneath the hum of well-bred conversation and soft, practiced laughter from Boston's financial elite. I spotted Jason almost immediately. At 36, my brother had grown into a near mirror image of our father. Sharp suit, perfectly styled hair, and the same confident bearing. He stood near the bar, surrounded by a small circle of admirers, telling a story that had them all chuckling politely. The golden glint of his cufflinks caught the light as he gestured. "Amanda," he said with a smile that barely touched his eyes. "Didn't think you'd actually come." He offered Scott a brisk handshake before turning back to his companions. "This is my little sister and her husband," he announced. "Amanda does something with books, don't you?" Before I could respond, he waved dismissively. "Scott, meet my colleagues from Blackstone Investment. We just wrapped the Reynolds merger last week." Without another glance at us, he dove back into talking shop, the conversation quickly steering toward market trends and projected earnings. Scott gave my hand a subtle, reassuring squeeze as we stepped away. We found Kimberly near the hors d'oeuvres table, a vision in a crimson designer dress that probably cost more than my entire monthly rent. She was flashing a massive diamond ring to two women I didn't recognize. "We're doing a June wedding at the plaza," she said, her tone breezy and superior. "Thomas wanted Tuscany, but I told him the humidity would ruin the photos." She caught sight of me and offered a thin smile. "Amanda, you came." Her eyes flicked over my navy blue dress with barely concealed critique. Navy is so dependable. She introduced us to her fiancé, Dr. Thomas Whitfield, a neurosurgeon with impeccable posture and a polished Harvard drawl. The conversation revolved around wedding plans and an exclusive medical conference in Switzerland. Minutes later, Kimberly excused herself to mingle with what she clearly considered more relevant guests. "Your siblings are exactly as advertised," Scott murmured under his breath as we stepped aside. I was reaching for a champagne flute from a tray when a bony hand gripped my arm. Aunt Patricia, my father's older sister, pulled me into a stiff, perfumed embrace. "Amanda, darling," she said, placing an air kiss uncomfortably close to my ear. "You look healthy." The pause between words said everything. Aunt Patricia had always aligned herself with my father, reinforcing his standards as reasonable rather than oppressive. She leaned in conspiratorially. "Try to make him proud tonight. It means a lot to him, especially with all his colleagues here." And just like that, she was gone, gliding toward Kimberly to gush over her ring. I stood still for a moment, absorbing it all. The banquet room was practically dripping with symbols of wealth. Towering floral centerpieces in crystal vases, a top-shelf liquor bar, trays of delicate canopies, caviar on mini bellinis, seared scallops, artful slivers of steak tartare. Around me, the conversations flowed effortlessly, from private schools and vineyard investments to ski chalets in Vermont. And then I saw him. Across the room stood Richard Harrington, my father. At 65, he still exuded the authority that had once ruled over our household. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his strong jaw and sharp suit making him look every inch the man of power he had always strived to be. He laughed at something one of the men beside him said, and for a fleeting second, I saw in his face a warmth I had rarely, if ever, received. Scott noticed my pause. "Want me to come with you?" I shook my head. "No, I need to do this alone." I took a deep breath and walked toward him, each step heavier than the last. He saw me approaching, but didn't stop talking. I stood awkwardly on the edge of the circle until a brief lull in the conversation allowed him to glance at me. "Amanda," he said, sounding surprised rather than pleased. "You made it. Congratulations on your retirement," I said, offering him the gift bag Scott and I had carefully chosen, an elegant fountain pen. "Thank you." He took the bag, but didn't bother to look inside, Gentlemen, this is my youngest, Amanda. She's in publishing. I actually run my own small press, I added. One of our authors was just shortlisted for the Massachusetts Book Award. His face didn't change. Amanda always had her head in the clouds, he said lightly, playing with books while her siblings built real careers. The men around him laughed, not cruelly, but with that practiced, indulgent chuckle that cuts deeper than open mockery. Speaking of which, Jason just closed a $40 million 0 cents deal, and Kimberly is engaged to Dr. Thomas Whitfield, chief resident at Mass General. The implication was unmistakable. Their successes were worth celebrating. Mine was not. It was nice seeing you, I said, my voice tight. I turned away before the tears in my eyes could spill. Scott was waiting with a fresh glass of wine, which I accepted without a word. That bad? He asked quietly. I nodded. The usual. I managed to take a long sip from my wine glass, the taste sharp on my tongue, but doing little to steady the storm within. The cocktail hour carried on around us, laughter and clinking glasses blending with the gentle strains of the quartet in the corner. I watched as my father moved among the guests like a monarch among subjects, shaking hands, smiling warmly, receiving congratulations as though they were tributes owed to a king. With each person he embraced, each heartfelt thank you he accepted, the contrast between how he treated others and how he had treated me grew more unbearable. When the maitre d' announced it was time for dinner, we discovered we'd been assigned a table far from the head of the room. The main table, where my father sat with Jason, Kimberly, and other prominent figures from his professional life, was positioned under the most lavish chandelier, clearly the place of honor. In contrast, Scott and I had been seated among distant relatives and junior colleagues. The table felt like an afterthought, and judging by the strained smiles and stilted conversation, our companions felt similarly exiled. Scott, ever the diplomat, extended a friendly hand. I'm Scott Taylor, Amanda's husband, he said brightly, unaffected by the subtle insult of our placement. An elderly woman seated across from us peered at me with mild curiosity. So, you're Richard's daughter? She asked, her tone more inquisitive than welcoming. The one who isn't a doctor or a banker? I nodded, forcing a smile that felt brittle. I run a publishing company, I replied. How nice, she said, her voice dripping with the kind of sentiment usually reserved for children presenting finger paintings. A hobby business. Throughout the three-course meal, I watched my father at the center table. He laughed generously, leaning in to listen attentively, placing his hand proudly on Jason's shoulder or smiling with fatherly warmth as Kimberly spoke. It was a version of him I had only ever seen from a distance, a man capable of affection, admiration, even joy. But none of it was ever directed at me. Beneath the table, Scott periodically squeezed my hand, his presence my only anchor. The lamb was perfectly seasoned, the wine aged to perfection, but everything on my plate tasted like ash. After dessert, the lights dimmed slightly and a microphone was set up. It was time for the formal speeches. First came the bank's CEO, who delivered a polished tribute to my father's 40-year career, his leadership, strategic vision, and steadfast contributions. Next, a longtime colleague took the stage, offering humorous tales from their early days in finance. Then Jason spoke. His speech, though technically about our father's legacy, was more a resume of his own achievements, carefully curated to highlight his financial prowess while subtly reinforcing their shared excellence. And then it was my father's turn. As he rose from his seat and made his way to the microphone, the room fell into a reverent silence. He looked utterly at ease, his posture straight, his expression composed. He didn't need notes. He never did. Thank you all for being here tonight, he began, his voice effortlessly commanding the space. As I look around this room, I don't just see colleagues. I see friends, mentors, and partners who've walked beside me through 4 decades at First Atlantic Bank. He spoke with eloquence about the evolution of the banking industry, about challenges met and victories claimed. He acknowledged mentors who had shaped him and mentees he had proudly guided. It was the most articulate and human I had seen him in years, charming, reflective, even warm. Then his tone shifted. "None of this," he said, his voice growing softer, "would have been possible without the unwavering support of my late wife, Elaine." My breath caught in my throat. He rarely spoke of her and almost never in public. "She understood the sacrifices that success demands," he continued, and for the briefest moment, there was a crack in his voice. "She was my foundation during the hard years. I only wish she could be here tonight to see what her strength helped build." Around the room, people dabbed at their eyes. I felt a tear of my own form as I reached for Scott's hand. My father paused, then straightened. "But a man's legacy," he said, his voice firm again, "isn't measured by wealth or accolades. It's measured by what he leaves behind, by who carries his values into the future." My heart skipped. Was this it? Was this finally the moment? Would he just this once recognize my work, my path? "I've been fortunate," he said, gesturing to the head table. "Blessed, really, in that regard." He turned toward Jason. "Jason has surpassed every benchmark, not just an investment banker, but a visionary. The Reynolds merger alone would define most careers. For Jason, it's simply another step on an extraordinary path." Jason nodded modestly, basking in the praise. "And Kimberly," my father continued, "a gifted surgeon, saving lives every day at one of the finest hospitals in the country. Just last month, she performed a procedure so complex, it's being written up in medical journals." Kimberly smiled, demure and composed, her diamond ring catching the light. My father raised his glass. "So tonight, as I close one chapter of my life, I raise this toast to what matters most. My real children, the ones who have made me proud." The applause erupted like a thunderclap. Heads turned to Jason and Kimberly, beaming as they received the accolades. I sat frozen, the words slicing through me with surgical precision. My real children. As if I were not even his child. As if I had never existed. But worse, far worse, was yet to come. As the applause died down, my father's eyes scanned the room, and then they locked onto mine. A hush settled over the crowd as his voice cut through the quiet. "You can leave." There was no mistaking the words. Clear, icy, intentional. At first, confusion rippled through the guests. People looked around, unsure who he meant. Then the realization dawned. All eyes turned to me. My father had just publicly disowned me. The air vanished from the room. My chest constricted, my vision narrowed. The ornate chandelier blurred. The string quartet had stopped. All I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears. Across the room, Aunt Patricia raised her hand to her mouth in disbelief. Even she hadn't anticipated this level of cruelty. Kimberly stared at her manicure. Jason wore a faint smirk, as if he'd just witnessed a perfectly timed punchline. The silence became unbearable. Dozens of strangers watched me, their eyes filled with curiosity, pity, or silent judgment. My legs trembled as I slowly pushed back my chair. The screech of wood against the polished floor echoed like a scream. The legs of my chair scraped against the polished floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense, hushed space. Shame coursed through me, searing and corrosive like acid spreading beneath my skin. This wasn't just another private wound inflicted behind closed doors. This was rejection turned spectacle, an open declaration that I didn't belong, that I was never enough to claim even a seat at the table. For as long as I could remember, I had worked tirelessly to earn my father's recognition, craving even the smallest sign that I had done something worthy in his eyes. And now, in the span of a single sentence, he had reduced all those years of effort to nothing. My fingers gripped the edge of the table, white-knuckled, as I battled a rising tide of tears. I refused to give him the satisfaction of watching me unravel. If I had to leave, I would go with what little dignity I still possessed. And then I heard a second chair scraping back from the table. Scott, I turned my head slowly, the edges of my vision still blurred from humiliation, and saw him rising beside me. He stood tall, calm, composed, but beneath that quiet exterior burned a fury I had never seen in him before. His jaw was clenched, his eyes locked on my father with a stare so steady it seemed to cut through the room like a blade. Confused murmurs rippled across the banquet hall. My father's face darkened visibly. He hadn't expected anyone to challenge his decree, certainly not Scott, whom he'd long dismissed as an irrelevant footnote in a disappointing story. Sit down, my father said sharply, his tone clipped and authoritarian. It might have been the first time that entire night he had directly addressed my husband. But Scott didn't move. Instead, he straightened to his full height, his shoulders squaring, his gaze unbroken. The room froze, suspended in tension. And then, in a gesture both subtle and seismic, Scott reached for his water glass. The soft chime of his spoon tapping against the crystal rang out like a bell, slicing through the silence. It was a gesture everyone in the room understood, a signal that someone intended to speak. My father's expression twisted into disbelief, his face flushed with rage. This was his night, his meticulously crafted narrative, and now Scott had disrupted it in the most elegant and undeniable way. "What do you think you're doing?" he barked, though the force behind his voice had begun to falter. Scott remained perfectly still, waiting. Only when every murmur had faded, when every eye in the room was fixed on him, did he finally speak. His voice was calm, steady, but carried effortlessly across the room. "I'd like to propose a toast," he said, "to the woman Richard Harrington failed to see." A collective gasp swept through the guests. My heart pounded against my ribs, stunned by the directness of his words. An older woman near us whispered, "Oh my God," to her companion. "For those of you who don't know me," Scott continued, "I'm Scott Taylor. I'm Amanda's husband. And since Richard has chosen to share his view of his legacy tonight, I'd like to share a little truth about the daughter he just told to leave." My father stepped forward abruptly. "That's enough," he said through gritted teeth. "Security will escort you out." Scott's response was cool and immediate. "By all means," he said, his tone measured. "But I wonder how tomorrow's headlines would read if the Boston Globe learned that Richard Harrington had his daughter and son-in-law thrown out of his own retirement party. I imagine your colleagues might find that detail illuminating." My father froze, eyes flicking toward the assembled crowd. Reputation was everything to him. Scott had struck a nerve. 3 years ago, Scott continued, turning back to the guests, Amanda launched Lighthouse Press using her own savings and a small business loan she secured independently, without a cent from her family. Last year, they published Salt and Stone, which not only earned a spot on the Massachusetts Book Award shortlist, but was recently optioned for a film adaptation. Gasps and murmurs rose again. Even I was stunned. That must have been the call Scott received earlier. He had waited to surprise me. "What Richard failed to mention," Scott went on, his voice unwavering, "is that Amanda has created a platform for underrepresented voices. Veterans, immigrants, survivors. Her literacy outreach has placed books in the hands of more than 3,000 underprivileged children right here in Boston." I felt like I was watching a movie, my life unfolding on a screen, narrated not by judgment, but by someone who had truly seen me. And while Jason was mastering hedge funds and Kimberly was performing surgical miracles, Scott continued, Amanda took a leave from college to care for her mother through her final months of breast cancer. She sat by Elaine's bed, reading her favorite poems, when her hands were too weak to hold the book. A lump formed in my throat at the memory. those quiet evenings filled with love and grief. But what Richard doesn't know, Scott said, his voice sharpening, is that Jason's first apartment in New York, the down payment came from Amanda's college fund. She gave it to him when he came to her in shame after a gambling problem nearly wrecked his credit. Across the room, Jason's face went white. That was our secret, Scott added, glancing at him. A rare moment of real sibling connection. She never asked for anything in return, certainly not for you to defend her tonight. The room was silent except for the sound of breath being held. For 32 years, Scott said, now speaking directly to my father, you've told Amanda she wasn't enough. Too sensitive, too idealistic, too unlike the legacy you wanted to pass down. You withheld affection, weaponized approval, and tonight, you tried to humiliate her in front of everyone who matters to you. He paused, then turned to address the entire room. My question is, does she really matter less? Or are you simply too blind to see what you had all along? But here's what you should know about family, Scott said, his voice ringing through the stunned silence. Real family doesn't issue performance reviews. His words held weight, each syllable echoing in the cavernous room like a stone dropped in still water. Real family doesn't measure love in achievements. Real family sees you, supports you, and stands beside you, not just when it's easy, but when it's hard, especially when it's hard. My father's face tightened. He found his voice again, laced now with authority and rising anger. You have no right to speak this way, not in front of my colleagues. You don't know anything about our family. Scott turned to face him directly. I know enough, he replied, his tone calm but unyielding. I know that a man who publicly disowns his daughter at his retirement dinner isn't celebrating a legacy. He's exposing its emptiness. The silence that followed was so thick it seemed to muffle even sound itself. You could hear the gentle clink of ice shifting in water glasses. Not a single fork moved. No breath dared interrupt the moment. Scott turned to me again. His gaze softened as he looked into my eyes. Amanda is the strongest person I know, he said. Not because she conformed to her father's impossible standards, but because she survived them and still managed to become her own person. He raised his glass one final time. So thank you, Richard Harrington, he said, his tone sharp but composed, for showing us exactly the kind of parent we'll never become. With that, he set his glass down on the table with finality and reached for my hand. The warmth of his fingers in mine grounded me as the rest of the world spun with a dizzying mix of shock, humiliation, and somehow relief. We turned and walked toward the exit. Our footsteps, echoing on the marble floor, felt like thunderclaps in the still air. No one stopped us. No one said a word. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, paralyzed by disbelief. Just as we passed the final table near the exit, my father's voice rang out again, sharp and desperate. If you walk out now, don't ever come back, he shouted. You're cut off. Do you understand? Both of you. We didn't stop. We didn't turn around. Scott's grip remained steady as we passed through the doors. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw an elderly man, one of my father's longest-serving colleagues, give me a subtle nod. Whether it was sympathy, support, or simple respect, I'll never know. But in that tiny moment, I felt seen. As the doors shut behind us, the muffled hum of shocked conversation exploded in our wake. The valet, clearly rattled by what he'd just witnessed, avoided eye contact as he rushed to retrieve our car. The night air hit my face like a benediction, cool, clean, and healing after the suffocating atmosphere of the banquet hall. Scott opened the door for me. We didn't speak until we had driven several blocks away, the glow of the hawthorn fading in the rearview mirror, like the remnants of a bad dream. Are you okay? He asked at last, his voice low in the quiet car. I wasn't. I was raw, shattered, humiliated. And yet, beneath all that, something else stirred, a strange, impossible relief. I don't know, I answered truthfully, but I think maybe someday I will be. Scott reached over and took my hand again. We drove on in silence, leaving behind the wreckage of expectation and reputation and heading toward something we hadn't named yet. But it felt like freedom. When we reached our apartment, the emotional dam broke. I collapsed onto the couch, sobs tearing out of me, decades of suppressed pain erupting all at once. Scott held me, saying nothing, his shirt soaking with tears, his arms a fortress around my grief. I'm sorry, I gasped. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. I'm not, he said firmly. I've wanted to say those things to your father for 3 years. She'll never forgive us, I whispered. Then that's his loss, Scott replied. And honestly, Amanda, his forgiveness isn't worth having. We stayed up talking until nearly 3 a.m., processing the night. The shock gave way to layers of emotion. Grief over what I'd never have, anger at what I'd endured, fear about what this meant for the rest of the family, and something else too. The first real sense of liberation I'd ever felt. Do you think I went too far? Scott asked quietly as we got ready for bed. You stood up for me, I said, when no one else ever has, not even me. Sleep came in fits, broken by the repeated buzzing of my phone. My father called 7 times between midnight and dawn, each voicemail more furious than the last. I let every one go unanswered, the screen glowing against the dark, like lightning in the distance. At 7:46 a.m., I received a text from Kimberly. You always make everything about you. Dad's retirement was supposed to be his night. You and Scott ruined everything, as usual. I stared at the screen. To her, I was the villain, the one who stole the spotlight, not the one who had just been ejected from the room. Then, at 10:17, I was on Tylenol. But twist I didn't expect came. Jason called. I almost didn't answer, bracing myself for more blame, but something in me hesitated and picked up. That was quite a show last night, he said. His tone was unreadable. I didn't plan it, I replied stiffly. There was a pause. Another pause. Then, is it true what Scott said about the apartment? Yes, I said simply. Why didn't you ever bring that up, even when I was not exactly supportive? Because that's not why I helped you, I said. You were my brother. You were in trouble. That was enough. Silence stretched between us. Then Jason's voice came again, smaller, unguarded. I never thanked you properly, he said, and I should have. It doesn't matter now, I said. Maybe it does, he answered, and his voice cracked. What Dad did last night? It wasn't right, Jason said. It wasn't an apology, but it was more than I had expected, the closest thing to solidarity he had offered in years. After we hung up, I stared at my phone, unsure what to make of the shift. Something had shifted in him, something real, and that too was part of the aftermath. When I returned to work that Monday, my boss, Marian, took one look at my face and immediately ushered me into her office. You look like you've just come back from a war zone, she said, pouring coffee into a mug and sliding it toward me. What happened? I gave her the short version, the most sanitized I could manage. Her response was immediate and firm. Take the week off, she said. We'll manage the Hopkins manuscript without you. I can't just stop working because of family drama, I said, almost embarrassed by the idea. Amanda, she said, her tone softer now, if you broke your leg, you wouldn't hesitate to take time off. What your father broke in you, that deserves space to heal too. I reluctantly agreed to take 3 days. I spent them oscillating between long, crying jags, silent numbness, and watching brainless sitcoms while Scott worked from home. He was there when I needed him and gave me space when I didn't. The world outside continued as though nothing had happened, oblivious to the quiet collapse inside me. On Thursday, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Aunt Patricia standing on the threshold, holding a large manila envelope. Her expression was different, uncertain, even vulnerable. "May I come in?" she asked. I hesitated, then stepped aside. She perched stiffly on our couch and refused any coffee or tea. "What my brother did," she said without preamble, "was unforgivable. I should have said something that night. And I didn't. I've enabled Richard for decades, told myself it was just how he was." She handed me the envelope. Inside were photos, old ones I'd never seen. My mother, pregnant with me, glowing with joy. A picture of toddler me on my father's shoulders, both of us laughing. Another of him showing me how to fish on a sunlit dock, his face uncharacteristically gentle. "Anyone's always like this," Aunt Patricia said quietly. After Elaine got sick the first time, something in Richard changed. He became obsessed with control, with measurable outcomes. It was like he thought if he could organize the world tightly enough, he could keep tragedy out. I looked at the photos again, glimpses of a father I didn't recognize. That doesn't excuse what he's done. No, she agreed. It doesn't. But I thought you should know there was a time when he loved you fully. That capacity still exists. Buried, perhaps, but real. After she left, I slid the photos into my desk drawer. I couldn't look at them any longer, but I also couldn't throw them away. Word of what had happened spread quickly through our extended family. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years texted for details. An in-law of my father's called to say she'd always thought he was too hard on me. The mythology of our family was cracking, and people were finally re-examining roles they'd accepted for too long. 5 days after the dinner, my father's name appeared on my phone screen. The panic attack it triggered was immediate and visceral. Tight chest, gasping breath, my vision tunneling. Scott talked me through breathing exercises for nearly 20 minutes. That night, he researched therapists specializing in emotional abuse and family trauma. "You need someone qualified," he said gently, showing me a list. "This is bigger than what I can help you carry." I chose Dr. Eleanor Waters. Her profile photo showed a woman with clear eyes and a steady, no-nonsense warmth. My first appointment was set for the following Tuesday. "What if it breaks me?" I asked Scott the night before. "What if I find out I'm even more damaged than I thought?" "You're not damaged, Amanda," he said, pulling me into his arms. "You're hurt, that's different. And sometimes things need to break open before they can truly heal." A week after the gala, the doorman rang. Our apartment. "Mr. Richard Harrington is here. Should I send him up?" My hand trembled as I hovered over the intercom. "It's your choice," Scott said. "We don't have to let him in." "No," I said. "Let's finish this." He looked smaller when he stepped through our door. Less composed, less sure. Outside the trappings of his title and status, he seemed unmoored. His eyes scanned our modest apartment, lingering on the bookshelves and the framed art prints with thinly veiled disdain. "I've come to clear the air," he began abruptly. "That scene at my retirement dinner. It was completely unacceptable." "You told me to leave," I said evenly, "in front of 70 people. What did you expect to happen?" "I expected you to respect my wishes," he said sharply. "Instead, your husband hijacked the event, turned it into some spectacle that made me look like a villain." Scott stayed silent as we'd agreed. This was my battle to fight. But I could feel his presence beside me, steady as a rock. "Did you come here to apologize?" I asked. And my father blinked. "Apologize for what?" "For publicly humiliating me." I was being honest about my disappointment, he said. I gave you every opportunity to become something meaningful, and you chose to squander them. In that moment, everything fell into place. The years of doubt, the anxiety, the endless attempts to earn affection from a man who never intended to give it. I finally understood. I think you should go, I said. I'm not finished, he snapped. I've spoken to my attorney. If you and Scott don't issue a public apology, you'll both be removed from my will. The old version of me might have panicked, might have begged for another chance, but not this time. We don't want your money, I said calmly. We never did. What we wanted was your love, your acceptance. But I'm done trying to earn something that should have been freely given. His face contorted with anger. You'll regret this. When you're struggling to keep your little book hobby alive, you'll wish you'd shown more respect. I didn't flinch. I respect myself now. No, I said firmly. That's enough. Without another word, my father turned on his heel and stormed out. The door slammed behind him so forcefully that the pictures on our wall shook. One fell, crashing to the floor with a crack that split the frame. I knelt to pick it up. It was a photo from our wedding. Scott and me laughing as we fed each other cake, the frosting smeared on our noses, our joy unfiltered and real. The glass had shattered, but the image was untouched. Symbolic, I murmured. What is? Scott asked, crouching beside me. The only thing that broke was the frame, I said quietly. We're still intact. He helped me sweep up the glass. We didn't mention my father again that night. Instead, we ordered our favorite Thai takeout, opened a bottle of wine, and talked about whether Portland might be a good place for a fresh start. The idea of relocating, of physically distancing ourselves from the shadows of Boston and its ghosts, felt more and more right. As I drifted off to sleep that night, one small realization anchored me. I hadn't apologized for anything that day. Not once. Not for taking up space, not for speaking my truth, not even for existing. It was a small victory, but for someone who had spent a lifetime apologizing for simply being, it was monumental. Tell me about your father, Dr. Eleanor Waters said during our first therapy session the following Tuesday, and I did. For 50 minutes, the words poured out, things I had never told Scott, stories I had buried, excused, or edited in the name of self-preservation. Dr. Waters listened intently, only interrupting to jot down notes or ask the occasional question. At the end, she looked at me and said gently, Amanda, have you ever heard of emotional abuse? That one question opened a door I hadn't known was there. It led me on a 3-month journey through therapy, learning to name patterns I had normalized, to identify how trauma had shaped my responses, and to begin the slow, messy process of reclaiming my self-worth. Dr. Waters explained how children raised on conditional love often carry invisible wounds into adulthood, how those of us who learn to survive by pleasing others eventually forget what our own needs look like. Healing isn't linear, she reminded me. There will be days when the old stories feel more convincing than the new truths. That's not failure. That's healing. She was right. There were mornings I woke convinced I was broken. There were work emails that sent me spiraling. There were still moments, quiet and sharp, when I found myself reaching for my phone, hoping for a text from the man who had cut me out of his life. The panic attacks didn't stop, not right away. Sometimes they came with a trigger, a voice, a scent, a memory. Other times they descended out of nowhere. Eventually, Dr. Waters suggested a low-dose anti-anxiety medication. It's not forever, she explained, just a tool while your nervous system learns a new way to exist. Within weeks, the difference was undeniable. The background hum of dread faded, sleep returned, laughter came more easily, I felt more present. With Scott, at work, and most importantly, with myself. Meanwhile, Scott and I began to research Portland seriously. Its thriving literary scene, progressive culture, and geographic distance from Boston all appealed. We built spreadsheets, made pro/con lists, compared neighborhoods. What started as a fantasy slowly became a plan. Are we running away? I asked Scott one night. We're running toward something, he said. There's a difference. That difference became real when Scott received a surprise job offer from a Portland-based tech firm that specialized in publishing software. The position came with a raise and remote flexibility, everything we needed. It's like the universe is on board, he said, showing me the email. We gave ourselves 6 months to transition Lighthouse Press, finalize work in Boston, and prepare for the move. I was discussing those plans with Marion at the office when she suddenly looked up, eyes wide. Amanda Taylor? A woman approached my desk, her designer perfume arriving a few seconds before her words. I'm Vivian Newell. I was your father's executive assistant for 15 years. My stomach dropped. If he sent you. He doesn't, she cut in. He doesn't know I'm here. I retired last month. He can't fire me anymore. She glanced around. Can we talk somewhere private? Over coffee at a nearby cafe, Vivian confirmed things I had always suspected and revealed even more. My father's perfectionism, his sharp criticisms, his withholding behavior. It hadn't just been directed at me. Made junior associates cry, she said. He'd take credit for other people's ideas. He held grudges for decades over minor slights, especially toward women. She sipped her coffee. The night of that retirement party, 3 different colleagues came up to me separately. All of them said the same thing. They were glad someone finally said what needed to be said. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Vivian stirred her coffee slowly. Because for 15 years, I watched you try to earn approval from a man who moved the goalposts every time you got close. I watched you question your worth, and I stayed silent. She reached across the table, briefly touching my hand. I'm not staying silent anymore. That conversation was more than surprising. It was validating. External proof that I hadn't exaggerated the pain, that I hadn't made it up. It hardened my resolve to build something better. Over the next few weeks, I reached out to relatives on my mother's side, people I hadn't spoken to in years. To my surprise, many welcomed me with warmth. My Aunt Judith, my mother's sister, invited us for a weekend in Connecticut. There, she opened a box of photos and journals I had never seen before. She would be so proud of you, Aunt Judith said, showing me pages from my mother's college sketchbook. You know, your mom was an artist too, before she met your father and gave up painting. Looking at the charcoal sketches, the handwritten poetry, I saw parts of myself in my mother, parts that had once been buried by expectation and obligation. And in that connection, I found something I never expected, a beginning. I had always believed my artistic inclinations were some kind of strange mutation, an inexplicable deviation in a family defined by practicality and achievement. I thought they came from nowhere. But discovering they were part of my mother's legacy, her hidden self, her suppressed identity, felt like reclaiming a missing piece of who I truly was. Months after the retirement dinner, I stood on stage at a small literary event, delivering a speech about Lighthouse Press and our mission to amplify voices too often ignored. About halfway through, I caught myself, really caught myself. Not stumbling, not second-guessing every sentence. I was speaking with clarity, with confidence, and without the mental loop of internal criticism that usually accompanied any public appearance. You were magnificent, Scott said later that evening as we toasted with a group of authors and friends. I didn't picture my father's disapproving face once, I said, amazed. Not even when I mispronounced that one author's name. That's a breakthrough, Dr. Waters said in our next session. You're beginning to internalize a new voice, the voice of your own self-acceptance. It's getting louder than his voice of judgment. Meanwhile, our Portland plans were accelerating. During a house hunting trip, we found a charming craftsman home with a converted garage, perfect for a small publishing office. We placed a deposit, anchoring our commitment to this fresh start in something real and tangible. Back in Boston, I expanded Lighthouse Press by launching a new imprint focused on memoirs about family reconciliation and healing from emotional abuse. It felt like turning my pain into purpose, offering a space for others to tell the stories that had once silenced them. My relationship with Jason continued to thaw, slowly but genuinely. He called now and then, and our conversations began to stretch beyond small talk. One evening, he admitted something that felt quietly monumental. That night, at Dad's party, it made me look at things I've been ignoring, he said, like how I've spent my whole adult life chasing his approval and how exhausting it is. I felt a quiet kinship in his words, shared recognition of a lifetime spent running the same treadmill. Kimberly, meanwhile, remained firmly in my father's camp. We received a formal wedding invitation addressed only to Scott, with a post-it note attached that read simply, "No drama, please." We declined the invitation, replying with a matching level of formality, and sent a generous gift from their registry. It was the closest we'd get to closure with her. 6 months after the dinner that changed everything, Scott and I began seriously discussing starting a family. It was a conversation I had long avoided, haunted by the fear that I might become my father, that I would replicate his emotional distance, his control, his cruelty. What if I'm like him? I whispered one night, voicing a fear that had lived in the darkest corners of my mind. What if I don't know how to love a child without conditions? Scott took my hand. The fact that you're asking that question means you won't be like him, he said gently. You're aware of the patterns. You're doing the work to break them. In therapy, I had a pivotal session. For the first time, I let myself express the full weight of my anger toward my father. No justifications, no softening. Dr. Waters suggested I write a letter I'd never send. I poured it all out onto the page. I hate what you did to me. I hate that you made me believe I was broken. I hate that I still, somewhere inside, wish you'd be proud of me. My hand pressed so hard into the paper that I tore it in places. But when I was done, I felt lighter. Not healed, but freer. In the days that followed, I noticed I wasn't thinking about my father as often. The power he had held over my emotional state was weakening. His absence was becoming not a wound, but a reality. 1 week before our move, I received an email from someone unexpected. The elderly man who had nodded to me as Scott and I left the retirement gala. I'm retiring to Portland next month, he wrote. Richard and I had a falling out recently over his treatment of a young analyst. It reminded me too much of how he treated you. If you and Scott are settled by then, I'd love to meet for coffee. Sometimes chosen family is more important than blood. As we packed our things into the moving truck, I came across the envelope of old photographs Aunt Patricia had given me. I flipped through them again. This time, they didn't hurt as much. They felt like stills from a different story, one I'd once been written into, but no longer belonged to. I packed those photos alongside newer ones, Scott and me hiking in New Hampshire, a snapshot of our booth at a literary festival, surrounded by smiling readers, a dinner party with friends who saw and loved us exactly as we were. On our last night in the apartment, I stood by the window looking out at the Boston skyline. Having second thoughts? Scott asked, wrapping his arms around me. No, I said truthfully. Just saying goodbye to the version of me that lived here. The one who never felt good enough. She was always good enough, he whispered. She just didn't know it yet. The next morning, as we drove west, I realized I hadn't checked my phone for messages from my father in over a week. It hadn't been a decision, just a quiet, natural fading of an old habit that no longer served me. The ache of his rejection had become something else. Not numbness, but self respect. Portland welcomed us with a week of unexpected sunshine, as if affirming our decision in a way the universe sometimes does when we finally choose ourselves. As we unpacked, I came across the cracked picture frame from that final night in Boston. The wedding photo of Scott and me laughing, the glass replaced. I think this belongs here, I said, setting it on the mantle of our new living room, a symbol of what we carried with us and what we finally mercifully left behind. The past made us who we are, he said, but it doesn't get to decide who we become. 1 year had passed since that night, the retirement dinner that cracked everything open, and now I stood in our Portland kitchen, a glass of sparkling cider resting against my belly, which was just beginning to round with our first child. Through the kitchen window, I watched Scott grilling on our deck, surrounded by friends, our chosen family. Laughter drifted in through the open screen door, mingling with the scent of cherry blossoms and barbecued vegetables. Spring sunshine filtered through the branches, painting the backyard in a mosaic of light and warmth. The years since leaving Boston had been transformative in ways I never could have imagined. Lighthouse Press had thrived in Portland's vibrant literary community, winning a Small Business Innovation Award for our outreach work with underserved youth and emerging authors. My therapy sessions with Dr. Waters had tapered to once a month, and the biggest change of all, I was 4 months pregnant. Do you need anything, sweetheart? Aunt Patricia asked as she entered the kitchen. She had flown out for our housewarming party, an act of quiet rebellion that had strained her already tense relationship with my father. But at 68, she'd finally chosen to prioritize her values over keeping family peace. I'm good, thanks, I said, smiling as I handed her a tray of appetizers. The doorbell rang just as I was arranging a cheese board. I opened the front door to find Jason standing there, looking slightly travel-worn but smiling, with the easy confidence of someone who had let go of some inner burden. Sorry I'm late, he said. Flight from New York was delayed. I hugged him, still getting used to the warmth in this new version of our sibling relationship. Over the past year, we had gone from strained phone calls to genuine connection. He had visited Portland twice, each time opening up a little more about our shared childhood and the weight of our father's expectations. Come in, I said, stepping aside. Everyone's out back. How's Claire? I asked, referring to the kindergarten teacher he'd recently started dating, a woman who, from what I could tell, was grounding him in ways I hadn't seen before. She's good. Wanted to come, but she couldn't get the time off. He paused, then pulled an envelope from his bag. I wasn't sure if I should show you this, but I think you should know. Inside was a printed article from a Boston business journal. The headline read, Former First Atlantic EVP Richard Harrington hospitalized after minor stroke. Beneath it was a small photo of my father, looking significantly older and, for the first time, diminished. He's physically okay, Jason added quickly, reading my expression. But it was a wake-up call. He's alone a lot now. Kimberly visits when she can, but the residency keeps her chained to the hospital. He refused to hire help, he continued, until he set off the smoke alarms burning dinner and the neighbors called me. I stared at the photograph for a moment. It didn't hurt like it once would have. Just a distant ache. I'm sorry he's unwell, I said sincerely. But I don't know what you want me to do with this. Jason shrugged. Nothing necessarily. I just thought you should know. I placed the article on the counter and promised myself I'd decide later whether it mattered. Today wasn't about old wounds. It was about everything that had grown from them. The house buzzed with conversation and laughter. Lighthouse Press authors chatted with Scott's tech colleagues. Aunt Patricia shared gardening advice with our neighbor. Jason gradually let his guard down, engaging with one of our authors in a surprisingly thoughtful discussion about narrative therapy. As evening settled, Scott raised his glass and called for everyone's attention. A year ago, he began, Amanda and I made the best decision of our lives. We moved to Portland. But our journey really started at a certain dinner in Boston, a night that could have broken us, but instead, it set us free. He turned to me, his expression tender. To Amanda, who taught me that real strength isn't about never falling, it's about rising over and over again. And to all of you, thank you for becoming our Portland family. Thank you for seeing us as we are. Glasses clinked, smiles bloomed across the room. In that moment, I felt something settle deep within me, a completeness I had searched for my whole life. The validation I had once begged from my father had always been an illusion, a mirage that disappeared the closer I got. True acceptance had nothing to do with approval. It was about standing whole and unashamed in the presence of those who welcomed me without condition. After the guests left, Jason stayed to help clean up, unusually relaxed as he loaded the dishwasher. I have a confession, he said as he folded a dish towel with surprising care. I've been in therapy for 8 months. That's great, Jason, I said, genuinely happy for him. It's changed how I see everything. Dad, myself, you. He leaned against the counter. Did you know I was jealous of you growing up? I froze, mid-rinse. Jealous of me? You were the golden child? I said, confused. I was the obedient one, he corrected. I did everything Dad asked. Got the grades, wore the suits, chased the money, and yeah, I got his approval. But you? You always knew who you were, even when it cost you everything. You had courage. I never had that. We talked late into the night, unpacking our shared past and realizing how much of it we'd experienced in silence. When he finally left for his hotel, he hugged me tightly. I'm sorry I wasn't a better brother, he said. We're writing a new story now, I reminded him. That's what matters. 3 days later, while browsing at Powell's Books, I got a text from Kimberly. The first message from her in months. Dad's asking for you. Probably nothing, Kimberly had added. Just thought you should know. I stood frozen in the aisle at Powell's Books, my fingers curling protectively around my slightly rounded belly. The old version of me, the one who lived in constant fear of rejection, would have dropped everything. She would have rushed back to Boston, desperate to interpret this message as an invitation, a potential moment of redemption. But I had changed. The new Amanda recognized Kimberly's text for what it truly was, an attempt to shift responsibility, to make the choice mine. If our estrangement continued, it would now be my fault, my decision. After thoughtful consideration and a long, grounding conversation with Scott, I typed a simple response. Thank you for letting me know. I hope he recovers well. Not a slam door, not a desperate run through an open one either, just a quiet acknowledgement of our shared humanity, separate from the wreckage of our relationship. 2 weeks later, I had an encounter that would have once undone me. While visiting a friend recovering from minor surgery, I turned a hospital corner and almost walked straight into my father. He looked thinner, frailer, one side of his face drooped slightly, subtle evidence of the stroke Jason had mentioned. His suit was still tailored, but his presence was diminished. Amanda, he said, his voice raspier than I remembered. Dead? I replied, surprised at the calm in my own voice. Jason mentioned you'd had some health issues. I hope you're doing better. He nodded stiffly. Just a checkup, nothing serious. We stood in silence in the sterile corridor, medical staff moving around us like water flowing past two immovable stones. You look different, he said finally. I smiled faintly. I'm pregnant, due in November. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps? maybe even something deeper, but it vanished as quickly as it came. I see. Congratulations. Thank you. More silence. I waited for an apology, for recognition of the pain, for something, but his expression remained unreadable, his posture tight. I should go, I said at last. My friend's waiting. He nodded. Give my regards to Scott. The casual phrase, the kind of thing people say after a pleasant dinner, felt almost absurd given the context. I nearly laughed. Instead, I nodded once and walked away. What struck me wasn't what he said, it was what didn't happen. No panic, no emotional collapse, no desperate yearning. I had spoken to my father as an adult, free from the chokehold of childhood wounds. I wasn't devastated, just contemplative. He'll never change, I told Scott that night. No, he agreed gently. Probably not. Are you okay with that? I thought for a moment. I think I am. For the first time, I understand that his limitations aren't my failure. That autumn, as the Portland trees flamed with color, we prepared our home for our daughter. Jason visited twice, arriving with absurdly extravagant gifts for his soon-to-arrive niece. Aunt Patricia mailed handmade quilts and updates on family gossip, including news that my father had started seeing a widow from his church. Apparently, she tolerated his difficult personality with surprising grace. Good for him, I said when I heard, and I meant it. His happiness or unhappiness was no longer tethered to mine. In late November, Lily Eleanor Taylor was born after 20 hours of labor. Holding her for the first time was like standing at the edge of the universe. A fierce, unshakable love filled me, pure and undiluted. Tears welled in my eyes. She's perfect, Scott whispered, touching her tiny hand with reverence. As I looked down at Lily's sleeping face, I made a silent promise. She would grow up knowing, without question, that she was enough, that love was not something to be earned, but something she already possessed, unconditionally. When Jason flew in to meet her the following week, he held her like she was made of glass, awe and terror competing on his face. She has mom's eyes, he said softly. I thought so too. He paused, then added, I told Dad about her. He didn't say much, but he has to see a picture. I nodded, unfazed. My father was no longer the axis around which my world turned. He was a footnote, a peripheral figure in a story no longer centered around him. As Christmas approached, we hosted a small dinner for the people who had become our family. Jason and Claire, Aunt Patricia, friends from the literary and tech communities who had supported us, seen us, loved us. The house glowed with warmth. Laughter echoed through every room. Lily was passed from lap to lap, her tiny onesie decorated with candy canes. After dinner, as we settled in the living room with dessert, Scott raised his glass. To family, he said simply. Not just the one we're born into, but the one we create through love and choice. To family, everyone echoed, their voices rising together. As I looked around at these people who knew me fully and loved me anyway, I finally understood the real gift that had come from that night in Boston. The moment that had felt like the end had actually been the beginning. When Scott stood beside me at that retirement dinner and took my hand, we hadn't just walked out of a banquet hall. We had stepped into our real lives, the ones we were meant to build. Later that evening, as Lily began to fuss, I excused myself and slipped into her nursery. I settled into the rocking chair, the one Scott had assembled while listening to a podcast about how to swaddle. The room smelled faintly of lavender and baby powder. I held Lily close, her breath warm against my collarbone, her tiny fingers curled around mine. And as I rocked her, the quiet humming in my heart wasn't fear. It wasn't grief. It was peace. Scott had restored something for us, something sacred. As I cradled our daughter in the soft evening quiet, her tiny breaths steady against my chest, I studied her perfect face and felt a calm settle over me like a benediction. It was a peace I had never known in my entire life, not truly, not until now. You will never have to earn my love, I whispered softly to her, brushing my lips against her downy forehead. It's already yours, completely and forever. And in that whisper, I realized I wasn't just making a promise to Lily. I was giving that same vow to myself. After decades of internalizing the belief that love had to be earned, that worth was measured in approval, accolades, and obedience, I had finally stepped out of the shadow of those lies. I had untangled myself from the narrative that told me I was too much or not enough, that I had to become someone else to be worthy. In this still, glowing moment, I saw the truth clearly. I was enough. I had always been enough. Not because I had proven myself, not because of the business I'd built or the success I'd achieved, but because I existed, whole, flawed, real. Outside the nursery, laughter drifted from the living room where our friends, the family we chose, gathered. They didn't love me because I performed for them. They loved me because I showed up as myself. And that was all they ever asked for. Lily's tiny hand gripped my finger with surprising strength. She didn't need to do anything to earn my affection. She simply was, and that was everything. This was my legacy now, not my father's cold standards or inherited pain, but this, a future built on empathy, on resilience, on love freely given, not a life designed by someone else's values, but one I created through authentic choices, moment by moment. That's the story I'll pass on. That's the truth Lily will grow up with. And now I invite you to reflect on your own. Have you ever had to break free from the weight of toxic expectations? Has someone ever stood beside you when you couldn't stand on your own and reminded you of your worth? If so, I'd love to hear your story. Leave a comment below. And if this journey resonated with you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear this. You are enough, exactly as you are. Thank you for walking this path with me. Remember, sometimes the bravest act is not fighting harder to stay, but choosing to walk away from what hurts us and toward the healing we deserve.